Hi guys. Let me see if I can maybe turn this music. I can't turn the music off without quitting. No more music. Forgot the question I was going to ask. That's okay. Ask it if you think of it. All right. Renting a movie is so expensive. I better go wipe out a drug den. That's exactly. I think, you know, that's what the '80s were like. That's murder orgies. Yep. Windows audio mixer. Oh yeah, I could do that. Would have been a smart thing to do. Okay. All right, here we go. Do you think the wobbly, pulsating style of the game makes you feel like you're on a drug-fueled rampage? That's an interesting question. I mean, there's certainly an element of drug use in the game, if only through this, you know, this woman that we picked up who was clearly overdosed on the bed, passed out from heroin. It's a good question. I can't say that it has made me feel specifically like, well, I mean, yeah, okay, all right. I'm not answering. I don't know. It's it is a very trippy aesthetic, like especially with the color scheme, and the wobbliness of it, the fact that it doesn't sort of stay oriented properly. And I think that is definitely trying to evoke drugs. I didn't make that connection right away because there's also a, I mean, I think it's a very similar haze to just simply like violence-induced haze. I mean, I feel like I'm on kind of an adrenaline rush, and I'm definitely like in an altered state. But that to me has felt more hormonal than drug-induced, because as a player, if I was playing this on drugs, I would probably feel differently. But as a player, I am absolutely getting that same hormonal rush, and that can also be disorienting. And so I'm feeling a resonance between the graphics, like the visual style, and the way that I feel when I get a flood of adrenaline every time, you know, somebody shoots me from off screen. Do I think the game glorifies violence? 100% absolutely. I think it glorifies it in a complicated, I think it has a complicated relationship with violence. And I think that it is trying to make some commentary. I mean, it's drawing attention to the violence in a particular way that I think is very self-conscious. Like I think it's super self-conscious about its violence. Let's put it that way. And you could read it as critical of hyper-violence, and specifically the amount of violence that there is in games. But regardless of whether or not you do that, even if you read it as being critical of that, it is approaching that problem by glorifying the violence, by absolutely like making the violence fun. That is what this game is doing. It's putting a lot of effort into doing that, and it's doing it successfully. So, you know, I don't think that means it doesn't have value, and I don't think that means it can't comment on violence in culture or violence in games or whatever it wants to comment on. But the answer to the question, is it glorifying violence, is yes, it is, absolutely. I noticed there's a subtle scanline effect on the levels in text. Do you think that's a purely stylistic choice, or does it have some narrative implication of watching all the action? That's a good question. We have seen, we've seen some themes of surveillance. That first boss battle, that was like that guy in the back room was watching everything on these screens. That's a great question. I find it very evocative of the time period. So it's, it is reminiscent of like CRT televisions or tube televisions that you would find in the 80s. It's got that kind of look. So I think it is partially for historical immersion. But the fact that there are definitely like narrative themes around surveillance and also certainly like at a higher level themes around control and identity and viewpoint, voyeurism almost. I mean, there's something very voyeuristic about this game. It's like a horror movie it's like an action movie, obviously, and you're playing the action movie, but compared to other games, even of this type, the graphic violence is very reminiscent to me of a horror movie, and horror movies are built on this idea of voyeurism, of the audience sort of taking guilty pleasure in watching things that they shouldn't be watching, that feel like they're taboo or that they're sort of inappropriate, or that they're not invited to, that you're an outsider who's gotten sort of a secret way to watch something that you shouldn't be allowed to watch. And in horror movies, often that's either sexy, that's intimate moments of people, often vulnerable, people displaying vulnerability, but often people like, there's a very sexy way that the camera approaches, especially female actresses in horror movies, that's played up by horror movies. And then also the graphic violence, especially in like slasher movies. This is something that's used, that's attached to that sense of voyeurism that really powers, I think, the emotion behind watching a horror movie. And I think there's something to that in this game too. It's so violent. You get this sense of being somebody who, you feel like you shouldn't really be watching this, but you are. And you're not only watching it, you're playing it, but you're also watching it. And so you have this kind of complicated relationship as a viewer with what's happening on the screen. And I think it does make sense that it being presented as though it's a broadcast television, or even recorded like it's like a VCR, and the fact that thematically, or we've had like narratively, the idea of videotapes come up as well. I think that is significant. I think you could definitely read it that way. Do you think your character is a good or bad person? Note that all, or at least most of the people you've killed are assumed to be bad people themselves, but is it justified? Do you want the character to be a good or bad person? Oh man, that's a good question. So I think you would be really hard-pressed to make an argument at this point that the character is a good person. You can make an argument that the character is like a vigilante, that there is a sense of justice that you're pursuing, that you're killing bad people. But I think actually, and maybe this doesn't come across as well in the stream as it does when you're actually playing it, but as I've said, it's viscerally rewarding to actually execute these actions, to play the game. The game feels good, and what you are doing that feels good is brutally murdering people. So whether that's justified or not, you are enjoying it, and by which I mean I as a player am enjoying it. And especially since the narrative is thin, is sort of vague, I don't have a lot to read into the character. So that's definitely something that I will read into the character. Because I am enjoying this, I'm going to read the character as enjoying this. So whether or not what he's doing is justified, it's very, very hard for me to say he's a good person, because I think he's getting a thrill out of all of the violence that he's committing. I'm curious to see where it goes. And the question of do I want him to be a good character or not is also interesting. Clearly, to some extent, I do. Because I got real excited when we were allowed to not kill that girl and like bring her home. And now she seems like she's okay. Maybe she's even recovering. Maybe she's better off than she was. I don't know that... Again, I don't feel like that justifies what we did, but I'm glad, like I'm happy about the prospect that we might have done that, because that feels good. So do I want the character to be a good character? I guess so. On the other hand, that's not really what the game is leading me towards. I mean, the game is absolutely raising questions about whether or not I'm good and what is the nature of good through those, like, 3 masked dudes in the back room who are asking me questions in a very, like, driver style way. But it's not about me being good. It's not about me enacting good. It's about me enacting evil. And it's a complicated evil, maybe. Maybe it's a justified evil, but it's evil regardless. And so, do I want the character to be good? I don't know. I think that's maybe not what the character is about. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what drives him. But, you know, if all of a sudden I could abandon being a contract killer and, you know, just get a day job, work in the video store, I feel like that would be extremely dissatisfying. Follow-up, are you enjoying the killing, brutality, or the simple game mechanic of beating/besting the game? Well, they're conflated. I mean, and that's one of the things that the game does, is it conflates them. So I think there's 2 answers to that. One is I'm absolutely enjoying the game mechanics. Like, the game is designed to be very rewarding for me, and so I feel that. And the game is tying those mechanics to the brutality, so transitively, I am enjoying the brutality. The brutality itself, trying to separate that from the feeling of playing the game, I have a complicated relationship to. I feel in a very mixed way about it. And it's the reason that I haven't played the game until now, is because it's, you know, it's so violent and it's glorifying violence, and that makes me uncomfortable, and that doesn't make me happy. And so it's really only on Valentine's Day that I want to, like, play a game like that. But it's at the same time, it is thrilling. Like, in a horror movie kind of a way, there's something exciting about seeing this kind of violence and participating in it, that is not pleasant, that's you know, that's horrifying. That's where the horror feeling comes from that you get in a horror movie. But it's exciting nonetheless, and so I do enjoy it, while at the same time I am repulsed by it. And I think me personally, in general, I'm probably more repulsed by it than I am attracted to it. And I keep cringing every time something especially horrible happens. And there are other people who probably have a slightly different relationship with that than I do. But I think it's matters of degrees. I think in general, the game does what it does because we are attracted to violence and horrified by violence, and the game does a good job of presenting violence in a way that sort of doesn't let you escape from either one of those feelings. The horse mask person is depicted as a lady on the official artwork. I did not know that. Assumed that the horse mask person in the back room was a lady, not sure why. I will pay more attention. Not sure. But apparently there's a suggestion in the artwork that that's true. I didn't pay that close attention to the artwork. Why do you think violence and killing is such a popular way to reward the player in games? Is it perhaps a particularly good and convenient substitute for score hunting, as in you pick/touch something and it disappears and you score points? You point a gun and a dude disappears and you score points. What's your take on it? Yeah, I mean, I think it boils down to that. I think that games, well, okay, so first of all, I don't want to limit my definition. So there are lots of different kinds of games, and games approach things very, very differently. And so I'm going to make some generalizations about games that are not always true and aren't necessarily true by any means. But in general, a lot of games and a lot of what we think of as games revolve around conflict. In the same way that a lot of, stories and things that we think about as stories revolve around conflict. I think that there's a quote from The Office that I love. I referenced this in a video that I tweeted about recently. So, but whatever, and that's what made me think of it. It's there's a quote from The Office where Michael Scott is taking improv classes. Or he's doing improv in his spare time or whatever. And his improv strategy involves, as early as possible in the scene, to pull a gun on his scene partner. Because in his opinion, there is nothing more dramatic than that. You can't top that. If somebody's got a gun, that's the most dramatic thing that can happen. And so he wants to get there as quickly as possible. And he wants to, have every scene that he does, there's kind of a sense that he wants to win it. And he thinks that he's going to win it by being the person who pulls the gun first. But he also wants the scene to be like as good as it possibly can. And in his mind, that means that it has as much drama as possible, as much tension as possible. And the way to do that is to draw a gun. I think video games are kind of stuck in this moment where two things have happened. One is we found something that works, and now we're doing it a lot. And that makes sense to some extent. I mean, you find something that works and you keep working it. The other thing is that it's just easier in a lot of ways to simulate violence as a way of resolving conflict than it is to simulate other more subtle ways of resolving conflict. So if every one of our games is going to revolve around conflict somehow, then what you are as a player going to be doing is resolving that conflict. The most direct conflict resolution is violence. I mean, violence is incredibly direct. It addresses a problem in a direct, brutal, sort of zero subtlety way. And it's often, based around these systems that are very easy to simulate. And so if we want to have a game that's not about violence, then we've got a different kind of a conflict, and we've got a different kind of conflict resolution. and simulating a different kind of conflict resolution is harder. And it's harder for both of these reasons. It's harder because a lot of the time it's just harder. I mean, a non-violent solution to a problem is less direct, generally. I don't know if I'm justified in saying that, but that feels true to me. That sort of in general, the most direct solution to a conflict and the violent solution to a conflict overlap. So if we're looking for a non-violent solution, then there's going to be more subtlety to it. There's going to be more systems involved. It's going to be harder to simulate. And also, we've trained people for years on how to use violence in games, how to express violence in games, and how to use violence to solve conflicts in games, to resolve things. So even if we use a different method of conflict resolution and it is abstracted from real life, but it's good enough to work in a game, there's a much larger learning curve that we have to take people through to understand this abstracted other solution. Whereas abstracted violence is something that we've gotten very used to. And so you don't need to teach that nearly as well at a conceptual level. I think Sean hits on something here. It's less about violence and killing being an important mechanic, but that it's based around conflict solving. You could, for example, replace all the killing in this game with some non-violent resolution so no one dies, but the actual game mechanics remain exactly the same. The trouble is that still ultimately conflict resolution between you and the enemies. And it's a particular type of very direct conflict resolution, right? There's no opportunity for me to take somebody out for coffee and talk about our differences, or even to figure out what somebody wants and see if I can help them with that. Those are non-violent ways of resolving conflicts, or compromise with somebody. Figure out what is it that we're disagreeing on, and is there a common solution that we can both be satisfied with? These kinds of non-violent conflict resolution feel very different than any kind of, if you want to call it non-lethal, anything where I go up to a guy and I press a button and that guy stops being a problem for me, he ceases to be an impediment. I don't care if I'm causing him to disappear, or I'm knocking him unconscious, or I'm transporting him to a magical fairyland where he'll be happy forever. It's still, that's a violent solution to the conflict, because, and it's violent in a way that it's maybe not graphic or lethal, but it's still approaching the conflict and taking the most direct, unsophisticated sort of solution to it, which is just to make the bad guy go away. And so of all of those possibilities that I outlined, the most realistic, maybe, or the most satisfying of those possibilities is that you're killing people, making them vanish into a magical dream world. That's a weirder concept, and it's harder to convey, and it's harder to understand, and it's less immediately satisfying. So if the mechanics are going to stay what they are, then it makes sense for the dramatic element of it to be you're killing people. If you were really going to make a game about some non-violent conflict resolution, then it would have very different mechanics than Hotline Miami. And there are games. There are lots of really, really good games that have very different mechanics than Hotline Miami and that are not violent. And a lot of adventure games, have mechanics that allow them to implement non-violent solutions to things. But violence is kind of a go-to. It's easier and it's more familiar, and I think just right now, where we are culturally with our relationship to games, that's just kind of that's the thing that we're doing. I think we're actually at kind of a critical point where that's changing, because there are more people playing different kinds of games and more people making games than ever before. We're experimenting more with different styles of games that don't have to be violent, don't lend themselves to violence in the same way. And that's very exciting. And games are becoming more mainstream and more sort of generally popular in the culture. And so they're finding an audience that is less enamored of violence, or at least less inured to it, who are curious about different things that games could be about. I think that's very exciting. I don't think violence in games is ever going to go away in the same way that violence in movies and violence in literature is never going to go away. But I do think that, we're at a moment where we're going to be seeing more and more games that take alternative strategies to resolving conflicts. For me, it's more the realization that many games and genres are based around conflict solving as a game mechanic. So I'm wondering what game mechanics could be developed that aren't based at all on conflict, and whether they would be satisfying. Yeah, so that's a much more experimental sort of tack to take. I would argue, because all of our, at least Western traditional storytelling is all based around conflict. If you look at narrative theory, at least simple basic narrative theory, if you look at like the hero's journey and that kind of thing, it's conflict is central to it. So you can write things that don't have conflict in them, and you can make movies that don't have conflict in them, and you can make games, I think, that don't have conflict in them, but they're going to look very strange compared to the things that we normally think of as, books and movies and games. I think conflict is pretty central to our normal understanding of story structure. Now, games are maybe in a place where they're less tied to traditional story structure than other media, because there's something else that as a player you can engage with. You can engage with the mechanics of a game, whereas when you're watching a movie, it's hard to engage with much of the movie other than the narrative. And so a movie without a traditional narrative, I think, is inaccessible. For most people, that's hard to watch, that's hard to understand. I think maybe it's possible that you could have a game, so there are abstract games, right? A game like, I'm just thinking about like solitaire. Well, there's conflict in solitaire. There's tension. See, unless you're going to draw a line that separates conflict from tension, and you can say you can have tension without conflict, then I think that works. But it's very, very difficult, I think, to make a game that doesn't have tension, because that's sort of that's what makes your experience of a game. That's what guides you in what you do. Or it's difficult for me to imagine a game that doesn't involve tension. And in my mind, tension implies conflict, and it might not be direct conflict, but it's at least conflict between two opposing systems or two opposing configurations of rules. Solitaire, I think there's a conflict between what you're trying to do and what you're allowed to do. So the fact that you can only draw one card or three cards or however you play solitaire, that's that is in conflict with what you're trying to do. It's sort of the analogy of golf, right? Golf is a game that's about taking a ball and getting it into a hole. But if you remove all of the conflict, if you remove all of the tension in the systems, then that means you just could sort of take the ball and put it in the hole, and that's no fun. The fun of the game comes from the fact that you start several hundred yards away from the hole, and you put the ball on the ground, and then you hit it with a stick until it gets into the hole. And that, like, now you've introduced a set of constraints that conflict with your overall goal, that create the tension that makes the game fun or interesting at all. So it's hard for me to imagine that, like, you could make what a game would look like that didn't have at least that kind of tension. The very idea of having something to complete provides conflict, doesn't it? You're trying to win or achieve, so surely to achieve that you have to defeat or progress against something, even if it's just a mechanic or like an underlying system. Yeah, I agree. I think that's sort of what I'm talking about. Something like Passage doesn't have conflict resolution, does it? Passage is interesting. So Passage is interesting for a couple of reasons. I mean, for one reason, because it doesn't lay bare what it is you're supposed to be doing. Like, its intention is not incredibly clear. There are a couple different ways to play the game. You can play the game trying to maximize the amount of treasure that you get. You can play the game trying to maximize the distance that you go, because I think that the length of the game, I think it's a fixed amount of time rather than distance. Although, frankly, if I'm wrong about that, then you could play the game to maximize the amount of time that you have playing the game. And it's not, the game doesn't make it clear, like, that there is a correct way to play, that there's a correct interpretation or intention. But it certainly does call out the fact that it's not making that judgment by, you know, one of the earliest decisions that you can make is whether or not to join with the woman, the companion, who appears early in the game. You can play without her. And if you play without her, then you can get more treasure than you could if you played with her. That honestly never occurred to me until somebody pointed it out. I just automatically went and joined with her. I think the game incentivizes you pretty hard to do that, like in its experience design up to that point. But there's you could make the argument that it's a game about collecting as much treasure as you want, as you can, and then the conflict is between your ability to do that and the constraints that get put upon you when you have a companion. Like, that creates a conflict. There's an implicit conflict between you and the companion. There's even a conflict between characters at that point, because a thing that you might define as a goal is being prevented by this other person. If you interpret the game differently, I mean, I guess the way that you would interpret that game so that there is no conflict is that it's just a thing that you do and none of it matters. But I don't know how many people choose to interpret it that way, because that's like the least engaging way that you can interpret it. So I don't know. I don't have like real definitive answer for you, but that's my thoughts. I haven't played Luxuria Superbia, but it sure looks cool. So I can't really speak to it as a game or as a conflict resolution or anything like that. But that's, you know, that's the kind of experimental game that I'm talking about, that I could imagine breaking this pattern, where you know, typical mainstream games, you're not going to find a typical mainstream game that doesn't have tension and conflict resolution, and so it's rare for you to find a mainstream game that doesn't have violence. I think he's trying to say that there might be a level of mutual exclusion between what makes a game and something that lacks conflict. But that level of exclusion depends on how shallow your definition of conflict is. It also depends on what your definition of game is. I mean, we get into a lot of really complicated formalist argument that it generally isn't productive. I mean, I think that I'm trying to communicate that a lot of the things that attract us to games are based on the tension that comes with conflict. And that's it. And so that's why it's hard. That's why most games have violence in them, because a lot of what is attractive to us about games is embedded with conflict. And the easiest way to resolve conflict from a simulation standpoint is with violence. Okay, I'm gonna, the semantics, I will admit to being a sometimes formalist, and to actually kind of loving getting into ridiculous pedantic debates about definitions and semantics. In general, though, I try not to do that, especially in a public place, because it's not productive. It's very self-indulgent, and it doesn't, like, the purpose of these different terms is communication, and so when I'm trying to communicate, all that really matters is that what I'm trying to get across gets across. At least that's the way that I take it. And so sometimes clarifying definitions helps with that, but often clarifying definitions is reductive or exclusionary, or just downright unhelpful. I mean, it often muddles things more than it actually clarifies things. So I enjoy doing it sometimes, and sometimes I'll catch myself doing it, but generally I think it's not a great use of energy. I'm going to go eat some kind of a lunch, and then my plan is to come back, let's say in 1 hour. So that's 3:30 Pacific time, and I'm going to play more Hotline Miami. So if people are around later this afternoon, I would love to have you join me. I'd love to have you help me through this emotionally, help me get through this brutally violent role that I've been asked to play, and do another Q&A afterwards. So thanks a lot, guys, for hanging out, and if you can come back, I'll see you in about an hour. Thanks.